right, everybody, thank you for joining me once again, where people continue to be wrong on the interwebs. They continue to be recidivist offenders. They continue to be this character. Paul Saladino, psychiatrist, who frankly ought to stick to that and stop making videos about human metabolism, human nutrition, health outside of his fields of expertise, those being general medicine and psychiatry. And yeah, really he should be staying in his lane, because every single time he makes another video and opens his mouth in order to once again support his ridiculous ideology, he digs his own grave still further in terms of his credibility. The other thing that Paul Saladino ought to refrain from doing for all time is commenting on the peer-reviewed literature, what it says and how it should be interpreted. The reason for that is because he is vastly, hugely, completely incompetent to read and or interpret studies, as I will show once again today, and not for the first time. So, Paul, off you go. Tell us all about your latest ramblings, and we'll put you right where you're wrong, which, spoiler, everybody, guess what? Once again, is going to be pretty much everywhere. All right, Paul, off you go.
What are the problems with the ketogenic diet, you say? Well, it's been shown pretty clearly that as you limit your carbohydrates, your cortisol goes up. Cortisol is a powerful stress hormone.
Well, no. Cortisol is a powerful hormone, yes. Cortisol is associated with stress, yes. But that's not the only thing that cortisol is associated with. It's also associated, for example, as a signaling molecule in terms of the energetic status of a person with the ketogenic metabolic pathway, which is not in and of itself stressful. The ketogenic pathway is a normal, natural part of human metabolism. All the enzymes and the pathway for ketogenic production is extant in human beings, more or less. Some subpopulations less than others. For example, the Inuit have less ability to produce ketones than do Western populations. Sure, absolutely. But nonetheless, human beings have evolved the ketogenic pathway over, it seems like, probably at least 4.5 million years. We are well adapted to it. It is not in and of itself a stressful situation. And the fact that cortisol is associated with that, as well as certain other events which are stressful, doesn't mean that cortisol is itself a stress hormone. Okay? It's one of those steps too far things that Paul does. Among others, Paul's not the only one. Let's be fair about this, but Paul is, nonetheless, parroting an unsupportable, nonsensical line of reasoning which doesn't stand up to even cursory refutation there. Okay, what's next?
It has nothing good to do in the human body.
Well, that's nonsense. Cortisol has nothing good to do in the body. That is just complete nonsense, Paul. Absolutely not a single scrap of evidence of any kind could support that ridiculous claim. That's the claim of an ideologue, not of a scientist or anyone remotely competent to comment upon science. Sorry about that, just the facts.
Most of the time. If you're running from a tiger, yeah, cortisol is probably a good thing. If a crocodile is chasing me around the water while I'm surfing, cortisol is maybe good.
Cortisol is a good thing when cortisol is released according to the machinations of the human body and its requirements, having evolved as such over at least 4.5 million years in the human format and very similar formats immediately proto-human in nature. Cortisol has its role to play. It's there for a purpose. It has evolved for a purpose, and it serves that purpose well. Still.
But most of the time, you don't want your cortisol to be high.
Well, again, that is a complete speculation, Paul. And again, how would you define high? A scientist operationally defines terms, and also a scientist gives us numbers to deal with, Paul, not concepts. Not ideas, not value judgment statements. So what are you talking about? I hope this gets better. I've actually watched it through, so I do know that it doesn't. That's why I'm making this video. All right, stick around. It's great.
When you restrict your carbohydrates, in the study I'll show you, they restricted them to 4% of the macronutrient ratios. 11 beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1, it's a mouthful. That's the enzyme that makes cortisol, went up. And
not strictly true, actually, Paul. Not strictly true at all. That's the enzyme that regenerates cortisol and keeps the cortisol concentration elevated rather than its natural inclination over time, according to its half-life to break down and for its value to drop. It's not necessarily making the cortisol, it's keeping the cortisol level up. It's kind of a regenerative pathway, in fact. And is it possible, do you think, Paul, that if the human body, having evolved as such to do the things that it does for 4.5 million years at least, that if it is upregulating a pathway that regenerates cortisol and keeps cortisol concentration higher than otherwise would be the case, do you think it's remotely possible that there's a reason the human body is doing that, Paul? Something to do with it actually serving a purpose at that time, perhaps? That would be amazing thinking, wouldn't it?
cortisol levels in the blood throughout the body in these individuals were known to be higher. So yes, eating a ketogenic diet raises your cortisol long term.
Okay, that's a cause and effect statement, and it may or may not be correct, but it's not actually supported by any empirical scientific evidence, Paul. We can say that those two things are associated, and we can say it's likely that it's cause and effect, sure, for which I have no problem, because cortisol serves many purposes in the body, some of which are associated with stressful/distressful situations to the body, and some of which are not stressful, distressful to the body, i.e. ketogenesis, for example. All right? I mean, one of the things that keeps ketone production going is an elevation of cortisol in the blood. It's a signaling molecule. It's a signaling hormone. It's playing the role of telling the tissues that create the ketones what the systemic energetic status is so that it knows what to do. The elevation of the cortisol serves that purpose at that time. And there are other mechanisms which negative and positive feedback loops that control the overall level of cortisol in that person's body, and a bunch of other inputs, covariates, confounds, collinearities, which can become quite inextricably teased together, will determine whether or not that person is in a distressful situation or whether they are not. Okay, you're being a reductionist basically, Paul, here, and you're also making assumptions that you cannot support. All right? What's next?
Why wouldn't it? It's perceived evolutionarily in our bodies as a stressful state.
Nonsense. Still.
So I would urge you to consider.
I mean, no stress, Paul, is dead. Being alive is a stressful thing, and stress isn't bad. Stress is the very thing that keeps us fit and viable to live through the level of stress that we encounter in the world. Distress is a different situation, and ketogenesis is not distressful for the human body at all. Why would it be? It is a perfectly natural, evolved part of our metabolic pathway that has its role to play at the appropriate time in the appropriate circumstances. Okay? What's next?
Consider that you are upregulating one of the most powerful stress hormones that has
still not true.
Aging effects in human physiology.
No, aging effects, cortisol, necessarily by itself, that's a cause and effect claim, Paul. Paul, who wants to tell us about aging, by the way, staff. Paul, an expert in aging. I mean, you know, we could have a look at some images of Paul, some photos taken only really a couple of years, 2 or 3, maybe 4 or 5 years apart. I don't know the exact time frame here. But we've all seen it. We've all seen it developing in terms of the apparent aging, haven't we, folks? We'll refer to that later as well. Here's a picture of me 12 years ago now, by the way. And now you can, well, anyway. Yes, tell us all about aging, Paul.
When you were eating ketogenic diet.
By the way, I've been eating a ketogenic diet for 27 years now. Okay, what's next?
Also, as I mentioned,
also, by the way, for those that want to know, I'm also a good 5 or 6 years older than Paul Saladino. Okay, just so you know what the context here is.
Mentioned earlier, methylglyoxyl, important.
Oh God, methylglyoxyl. This is Paul parroting the same nonsensical rubbish that I've already dealt with again and again and again, totally ignoring, not even acknowledging the fact that he's been absolutely dealt with and debunked on this issue multiple times, but yet he's just absolutely unblinkered, or blinkered, depending how you want to think about it, just parroting the same nonsense again and again and again, knowing full well as a psychiatrist that if you tell a lie enough times with enough apparent confidence, that a certain percentage of the population, a large percentage, will start to take that lie as the truth. It's disgraceful behaviour, Paul, actually. It's unforgivable. It's misanthropic malpractice of the highest order, and you need to stop it. All right? What's next?
Advanced glycation end product, which doesn't look good for humans at all, is upregulated by the ketogenic diet. So
okay, great. So show me any studies whatsoever of an experimental nature over multiple decades with appropriately designed, appropriately randomized, appropriately powered selections of human beings who are genetically identical at the outset, kept in labs for multiple decades under lock and key with every possible confound, covariate and collinearity controlled in the first instance before the data collection, that shows any even association with any hard health outcome of any kind in human beings as that relates to the ketogenic diet or cortisol or methylglyoxyl, Paul. Shall we wait for that? I don't think we will. No such study exists. This is speculation. Scientists concern themselves with what can be established empirically. Scientists do not concern themselves with speculation, Paul.
I'll show you both of those studies, and then I'll move on, and we'll really dig into carbohydrates a bit more. This is the study that I would suggest you check out if you're interested in cortisol and ketogenic diets. Dietary macronutrient content alters cortisol metabolism independently of body weight changes in obese men.
Yes, we can read, Paul, perfectly well. Thank you. Tell us what the study's all about, would you?
As you can see here, they looked at 17 obese men, 4 weeks of ad libitum.
Okay, so a whole 17 individuals for a whole 4 weeks. And you want to tell us about long-term health implications of ketogenic diets on the basis of this study, Paul, do you? Okay, so the first thing you need to understand as a scientist, anyone who wants to be interested in being a scientist or interested in science in any way, needs to understand that you cannot extrapolate the findings of a study beyond its tenure. This study was a 4-week study. It informs on phenomena that occurred over 4 weeks and 4 weeks only, and in a very, very small number of men and men only. So therefore this is not viable to women whatsoever. And also these men all had BMIs over 30 at the outset, i.e. obese individuals as per the BMI definition of obesity. So it's not applicable to anyone who is in a normal weight range or in an underweight weight range either. And there are many reasons why these people who were obese would have metabolically reacted to the intervention of this study differently to normal weight or to underweight individuals as well. So there's the limitations of the study before we even get going on its other failings, foibles, and pseudoscientific crackpottery. Do go on the Paul. Paul, you're doing a great job, son.
Meaning they could eat as much as they wanted, high fat, low.
Right, so an ad libitum diet. So did they control the diet? No. Oh dear. Are we done with this study now, boys and girls? Can we move on to something else? I'm done, but Paul isn't, so we'll deal with whatever else he's got to say.
Carbohydrate, which is 66% fat, 4% carbohydrate. That's pretty ketogenic. Or a moderate fat, moderate carbohydrate, which is 35% fat, 35% carbohydrate diet. Conclusions, a low carbohydrate diet, which is 4% carbohydrates in the study, alters cortisol metabolism independently of weight loss.
Yes. So, I mean, the mere simple fact of the matter here is that one of the things that signals the body to produce ketones is an elevation in cortisol. It's a signaling molecule involved in that process. So, what happens is the synthesis and regulation of the enzyme involved in the re-synthesis of cortisol, keeping the cortisol level up, is upregulated. As it ought to be. The body is responding exactly the way the genes are designed by natural selection over 4.5 million years at least to operate. It's almost as if there's a plan of some kind here. Goodness me. If you're experiencing noise disturbance on the audio, I apologise for that. It is chucking it down with rain here. Nothing I can do about it. I didn't get a vote in that. Right, what's next?
In obese men, this enhances cortisol regeneration by 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1 and reduces cortisol inactivation by A-ring reductases in the liver without affecting subcutaneous adipose 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1.
Yes, right. So the body says, right, we need to produce ketones because they are needed at this time. The signaling molecule, or one of the signaling molecules involved in the process of keeping ketogenesis rolling, is cortisol. So let's upregulate the enzyme that resynthesizes cortisol and keeps the level up, and let's downregulate another enzyme that assists in the breakdown process of cortisol and slows that down, thus keeping the level of cortisol up precisely to achieve the goal of signaling the tissues involved in the creation of the ketone bodies to keep doing that. Brilliant, no problem.
Alterations in cortisol metabolism may be a consequence of macronutrient dietary content.
See that word there, may, Paul? That's a great thing that scientists love to use that word, because when you write may, it leaves the other thing entirely on the table and it makes no statement about which position you're taking. It's one of those unchallengeable, you can write whatever you like so long as you write may. Okay, that's not scientific language. It's very, very poor choice of words, and the editors of the journal that accepted that probably need to give themselves several uppercuts. Okay, because maybe not two.
And may immediate effects of diet on metabolic health.
Effects and health. Okay, there's a cause and effect statement regarding health. Great. Paul, show me any study which is experimental which can inform on cause and effect over any period of time under decent control and all those other things I spoke about earlier, over any period of time at all. Shall we wait? Perhaps not. Okay, what's next?
As you can see in this study, both groups lost weight at the end of the trial, and in fact,
Not actually. The noise to signal ratio there is such that there's nothing to see there whatsoever. There may well have been a statistical difference between the mean values, but that tells us absolutely nothing about the trends of what actually occurred in that population. It might well have been that of the 17, potentially. You might have had one or two really large responses in one direction or the other, and you might have had 15 or 16 responses in the opposite direction that were swamped by the one big one. Statistical power, signal to noise, it's just nonsense, Paul. You've been had, and you've been had because you are destitute of competence to read statistics and understand what they mean, and to think critically as a statistician. It's because your training is in psychiatry, Paul, and general medicine, not in science, not in statistical inference, not in statistical anything, not in research design, not in science, not in any of that. Certainly not in nutrition, certainly not in human metabolism. No, son. Psychiatry and general medicine. Go and do that, perhaps. That'd be a good thing for you to do.
BMI and the fat mass of high fat, low carb was not statistically different than...
So, what does it tell us about clinical differences?
Medium fat, medium carb. So thinking about what you're eating can help you lose weight.
No, not thinking about it can't do that. No, you have to actually make a change to your typical eating pattern if you want a change in your body composition as it's typically been hitherto. Thinking about it will not have any effect, Paul. Okay?
Don't have to be ketogenic to do that.
Yeah, that's right. You don't have to be hugely ketogenic to lose body fat over time. Neither do you need to be constantly in ketosis at any level, ever, to lose body fat. Who says you do? I know some people do say that. I'm not one of those people.
As I've said in the past, I think the benefits of a ketogenic diet are in that it controls appetite.
Well, what you think about it, Paul, is really neither here nor there, because you are, son, a psychiatrist and a general physician. You are not a specialist in human metabolism, the energetics of cell function, human nutrition, or anything remotely connected to any of those fields. Mr. Let's age well.
But if you think about the quality of your foods,
I do, yes.
You remove foods, specifically artificial sweeteners, like
well, that's not food, Paul.
I talked about in the last podcast, which will hijack.
Sit on your hands, Paul, when you're presenting. Keep your hands by your sides. Waving your hands around wildly is not going to actually assist anything whatsoever. It's only distracting and somewhat irritating.
Your appetite and your
not half as irritating as the absolute nonsense that comes out of your mouth, Paul, every single time you open it, mind. But that's for another day.
insulin signaling.
That's also for today, because that's what we're doing here.
Something that many people on ketogenic diets are still eating. High fructose corn syrup, as we'll talk about in this podcast, and seed oils, which will contribute to underlying insulin resistance.
Yes, absolutely. All of those things are shocking, and you should get them out of your diet. Yes.
Your satiety will be better, and you can still lose weight and eat.
Fat is what we're talking about here, Paul. Call a spade a spade. Fat is not a dirty word. Fat is the thing that people are looking to have less of on their body, not weight. Weight is made up in many different ways in the human body. Muscle, fat, water, that's the largest component by far, skeletal structures, viscera, It's not about weight. Weight's got nothing to do with it. It's about body composition. Okay?
Carbohydrates. I'll repeat that statement because it is so important. You can still lose weight. In fact, you can lose an equivalent amount of weight just improving your food quality and eating carbohydrates.
No. Bad idea. Well, you can lose weight in a lot of different ways. You can also lose fat in a lot of different ways. That doesn't mean any of them necessarily are equivalent in terms of their indication by way of health long term. Okay, because there is no place whatever in the human diet for exogenous carbohydrate at any level, Paul. It's that simple. It is damaging, vastly damaging to the human physical body structures. Vastly, hugely, rapidly damaging.
As you would on a ketogenic diet, and then you have all of the benefits of doing that, which are actually not yet.
By the way, what I didn't say about that study that Paul showed a few minutes ago about the changes in cortisol metabolism, what Paul forgot to mention there is that study was actually an infusion study. What they did is they took those men, those 17 men, all of 17 of them, or over all of 4 weeks, and at the end of their 4-week intervention, what they did is they infused cortisol through a cannula and saw how quickly the cortisol that was infused was broken down by those men's bodies. So, applicability to the real world. Anyway, what's next?
Getting the negatives of a ketogenic diet.
There are no negatives of a ketogenic diet so long as it's sensibly planned, sensibly executed, and is based on what is evolutionarily consistent for human beings. Okay?
Hormonal interruptions, electrolyte issues, sleep issues, all these things.
All of those things are associated potentially with a style of ketogenic diet, which is promoted by charlatans who actually know nothing about ketogenic diets or human metabolism, nutrition, or anything else, who suggest that you need to be in ketosis, and the higher the level of ketosis, the better, consistently and persistently, and to avoid anything whatsoever that would bump them out of ketosis for any period of time, and that's what causes the problem. Such people also tend to abuse their bodies by consuming vastly too much organ meat as well, and potentially not enough protein for their individual needs, possibly too much fat, and then they end up with the problems that you experience, Paul, which they then turn around and blame on the diet, when actually the fault was their own because they did it wrong. They did it completely wrong. They did it in a way that is not consistent with our evolutionary past, and as such is just as much an inappropriate diet as one that's made up of the wrong foods. It's damaging in a different way. We have to get all of these things right in terms of what we did, in terms of our past in the last, at least, shall we say, 350,000 years, probably more like 4.5 million. Okay? And, avoiding all perturbations that bump us out of ketosis at any time is one of those things that's not consistent. All right? What's next?
That come along with that. So first problem with a ketogenic diet, increasing cortisol, clearly.
That's not a problem. That's indicated. It's in line with what the body's design is in order to maintain that ketogenesis when it's required.
Shown in the medical research. Second problem, methylglyoxyl.
No. We'll deal with that in a minute, I suppose, because Paul's going to go over it again and I'll have to debunk it again.
Talk about that right now.
Now, okay, good.
As I mentioned, methylglyoxyl is a advanced glycation end product, which looks...
Yes, advanced glycation end product. That's the hint, Paul. Glycation. Glycation, for those that don't know, is damage to tissues, metabolic intermediaries, etc. in the body, which is caused by sugar molecules becoming appended to those structures and or intermediate metabolites and all of those kind of things in such a way as to derange those structures and products and render them useless and indeed pro-inflammatory, damaging. They're the sorts of things that can lead you to look like you've aged 50 years in the last 3 or 4, for example, Paul, potentially. The very sorts of things caused by glucose as one of the glycating agents. Fructose, which is another glycating agent, which is 7 to 10 times more powerful in terms of its ability to damage tissues. Paul, I know that you take a lot of fructose in your diet. I also know that you falsely claim that the HbA1c test is sensitive to glycation damage from fructose, which is false. It is not. Anybody that knows anything about these assays, and even the authors of the paper you used to try and make that claim not that many weeks ago, clearly, unequivocally, in black and white, in very simple English said, no, it's not sensitive to fructose, and that test misses the glycation damage from fructose. However, Paul, cameras don't miss that. Cameras can see that stuff pretty clearly. That's a shame for you. Nonetheless, those are the facts. And we'll move on to the next point.
Looks pretty bad for humans. This is an interesting paper. Ketosis leads to increased methylglyoxyl production on the Atkins diet.
Yes. So, production is one part of a balance of production versus breakdown of any number of different substances, methylglyoxyl included. The body has ways of dealing with methylglyoxyl and potential methylglyoxyl-induced damage as well. The balance of how well the body is able to maintain those systems of control of the situation, really it's dependent on a number of independent variables, codependent variables, collinear variables, all sorts of things. It's one of those rich tapestries that it's very, very difficult, nigh on impossible to tease out in something as complex as a human body. There are no experiments existing anywhere in the literature that can point to any association, even, let alone cause and effect relationship, between elevated methylglyoxyl and deleterious health outcomes in human beings in any size pool of subjects that are kept in laboratories for any period of time whatsoever. under any sort of control whatsoever. This is another speculation on the part of Paul Saladino, psychiatrist and general physician. Okay? This does not establish that a problem exists in any way, shape, or form. Too many leaps of faith, Paul, beyond what this paper is able to inform upon. Okay? At all. What's next?
You can see here very clearly stated in this paper that Atkins subjects with ketosis had even greater increases in methylglyoxyl, 2.12-fold.
Yeah, okay, well, let's have a look at the signal to noise ratio in that study, shall we, and see whether there is actually anything to see there or whether there actually isn't anything to see there. Here is the paper. And we scan down to the chart which describes the change in methylglyoxyl after a period of time on the Atkins diet. Okay. Number one, it's well to note that these investigators did not keep these people in a lab for 60 days and observe them. They took these people's word for whether they were or were not following the diet, and they took several of the outcome statistics as reasons to exclude a person under the suspicion that they weren't following the diet without knowing whether they were or were not in fact doing so. Ergo, an invalid study. One of the things they did is said if a person wasn't producing ketones, then, ergo, they were not following the diet. Ergo, they were excluded. Maybe they were following the diet. Maybe they were producing ketones. Maybe the test of ketones didn't show up for various reasons, because other things like activity level, stress, etc., can lead to how your body deals with ketones and what level they are retained at, etc., or, all of those kind of things. It invalidates the study entirely, is what I'm saying. Secondly, you'll notice a complete lack of any error bars on any of these circular figures anywhere on this chart. We have to actually go searching for the signal to noise indication. It's not given to us on this chart, and there's a good reason it's not given to us on this chart. And here it is down here. Right. Okay. On the pre-diet, whatever that was, because they all had different diets, all these particular individuals, they weren't controlled, they were just on whatever diet they were on. They had an average value of 113.6 nanomoles of methylglyoxyl per what, I don't know, because that's not clear on this chart here either, but whatever, fine. Plus or minus 38.6, which would be the first standard deviation, in the absence of any clear statement that the plus or minus refers to some other metric. That would mean we would need two of those in either direction to encompass 95% of that data set, which would be basically, let's call it 77, just over 77. So it's 113 plus potentially 77. And here, which would give us about 190. And here we've got 189, so nearly about the same value, plus or minus 72.7 for the first standard deviation. What we've got here is massive, incredible, completely over-the-top, ridiculous noise and very little, if any, signal. So while we have a statistical difference in the mean values, we have no ability to speak sensibly about the trends actually observed in those people who undertook that study at that time. Nothing to see here whatsoever. So there isn't even an indication that, clinically speaking, there was a real difference in methylglyoxyl for any given individual, likely, in the population that was observed even in the study, let alone that is even associated with deleterious health outcomes let alone the cause of any. All right? Just nonsense, Paul Saladino. Absolute, unfettered, ridiculous nonsense from start to finish. You basically have no idea what you're doing when you're reading these papers. You are not competent to read these papers and talk sensibly about what they actually do inform us on and don't, and as such you should refrain from doing so. You don't see me running around playing amateur psychiatrist, do you, son? You don't see me having people come into the office and lie down on the couch and be Freudian with them. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not trying to be one. You're not a nutritionist or a metabolic specialist or anyone who can remotely sensibly talk on this topic. Stop trying to do it, son. You're out of your lane. You're not qualified here. You're making a fool of yourself. Stop it. All right? Very, very straightforward. What's next?
As well as acetol and acetone, which increased 4.19 and 7.9 fold respectively. So this is a study to show that methylglyoxyl has been measured in patients.
Yes, but the results in terms of noise to signal ratio were such that it's impossible to sensibly speak about what actually occurred. So there's nothing to see here.
Doing an Atkins diet, both a low-carb version and a ketogenic version, and methylglyoxyl, a harmful advanced glycation end product.
Well, no, harmful to tissues under certain circumstances, such tissues being isolated in a test tube in a lab, Paul. There are no studies linking methylglyoxyl concentrations at any level with heart health outcomes in free-living human beings, whole human beings living and existing in reality in the universe. None at all. Speculation.
In humans was significantly raised in both of those situations. Now,
significantly statistically, but clinically, there's no way to tell. Noise to signal ratio, nothing to see here.
This is something that I was never warned about when I was doing a ketogenic diet.
And why would you be? Because it's complete mechanistic speculation without the slightest bit of support. It's nonsense, Paul. It's pseudoscience. It's propaganda, smoke and mirrors. It's fearmongery. It's researchers desperately trying to find something to publish things about in order to keep themselves viable as scientists, because that's what you have to do in science, is publish things, or else you don't get continued. So you desperately look for things to write about. Doesn't mean that they're actually of any meaning or use to anybody. Okay?
No one was really speaking about this.
Well, because it's nonsense, Paul, that's why.
When I was talking about this, and so I wanted to bring it to people's attentions that I fear.
Yes, your fears, Paul, have no bearing on reality, and they have no value to people out there in the world, especially considering, Paul, your fears regarding human nutrition are unfounded on any basis that you have any training in human nutrition to speak of whatsoever at all. You are a psychiatrist still. Well, actually, I say you're a psychiatrist, but it seems like you've actually never practiced medicine, not one day in your life, actually, neither as a general physician nor as a psychiatrist. You completed your rotations, as I understand it, and then went off directly to be a social media influencer. Never practiced medicine. I may be wrong about that. If so, I apologize. Please do correct me on it somewhere. But my understanding is you've never actually done a day's work as a physician in any field in your life. Just out of interest for people that want to know. So not only is Paul not credible as a commentator on nutrition or metabolism or science, he's also not credible as a physician because he's never done that. Okay? What's next?
That in many ways, methylglyoxyl, cortisol, that a ketogenic diet will age you faster.
Yes, Paul, tell us all about things that will age us faster, please. Absolutely. Tell us all about aging rapidly. Again, here is the comparison of you several years ago with today, and here is a comparison of me 12 years ago compared with today. One of us apparently knows something about aging rapidly, and one of us thinks pouring honey and carbohydrates down your neck and amounts up to 400 grams a day is a good idea. One of us is right, Paul, and one of us, unfortunately, is not. The sad thing is that the one who is not right, that's you, Paul, by the way, is the one who, for some reason, enjoys a subscriber base 10 times the size of mine. Probably it's because of your personable presentations. You're giving people good news about their bad habits and telling them it's perfectly okay to pour carbohydrates down their neck. Who knows? But anyway, I think the facts are becoming ever clearer. Every day that passes, Paul, one of us seems to be existing in a different time zone to the other one, or a different frame of reference in terms of relativity. One of us is aging rapidly, one of us isn't. Sure, it's just n equals 2 and we're not genetically identical and all other factors are not controlled. But I'll tell you what, Paul, nonetheless, I think it's an interesting observation. Right, what's next?
Than if you are eating carbohydrates. And that is not a good thing. We all only get a certain number of heartbeats, a certain number of breaths in our lives.
Yep.
I don't really want that wick to burn faster.
So why then, Paul, would you pour 400 grams of contraindicated, damaging carbohydrates down your ignorant neck every day of your stupid life? Why would you do that, son? Completely unnecessary. The indication that you've provided us for pouring those carbs down your neck is to do with a factor that was entirely under your control, actually, had you researched the correct approach to a species-appropriate, species-specific diet in the first instance, which you failed to do. And that is, by the way, a diet based on the muscle meats and associated fat of mostly large ruminant animals, very few organ meats, not tons and tons of them, and certainly not freeze-dried supplements on top of that. Okay? And no carbohydrates or fiber to speak of, with the correct sort of ratio of meat to fat. You got all of those things wrong for your needs. That's what led you to your electrolyte disturbance, your palpitations, your sleep disturbance, your leg cramps, all of those things. All you needed to do was actually eat a species-appropriate, species-specific diet correctly, and that would ameliorate your problem. You didn't do that, and you found relief in pouring carbohydrates down your neck. They did deal with your lack of your insulin response. That was a function of your inappropriate diet. Sure. And solve that problem. But in so doing, you've brought a whole bunch of other problems on yourself, apparently. Anyway, let's move on.
When I'm trying to do something that is health promoting.
Yeah, but Paul, trying to do something that's health promoting by doing something that clearly patently is not deserves no plaudits. Okay?
As I mentioned earlier, there are many ways to lose weight outside
but weight is irrelevant.
Of a ketogenic diet. And just because you're losing weight doesn't mean something is healthy.
Correct. And just because you've solved an electrolyte disturbance issue by pouring carbohydrates down your neck in the amount of up to 400 grams a day, Paul, doesn't make that healthy either. It still isn't. Touché.
Just because a ketogenic diet leads to weight loss doesn't mean that it's healthy for you in the long term.
Yeah, but it's got nothing to do with weight. It's to do with the use of fat as a substrate for energy production. And a ketogenic diet, which is of the format which is evolutionarily consistent with human experience on this planet over the last 350,000 years, is health promoting for that very reason. It's because those are the genes selected for, whereas the genes that weren't helpful towards that were selected against. That's how Darwinian evolution works, Paul. Okay? It's pretty straightforward, really. We have the answer from stable isotope testing of the skeletal remains of humans of all ages ever found anywhere around the planet anywhere, and they all agree within 5% as to what the percentages of animal products, plants, but were being eaten by human beings throughout time immemorial, in fact. We know the answer. That tells us what we should do today because our genes have not changed significantly Since then, genes change glacially, whereas our lifestyles have changed in the blink of an eye, immediately, basically, in genetic terms, and we have not been able to cope with that change. That's why we have the public health disaster that we have on our hands on this planet today, or that among other things. Yeah, we'll get to those other things another day, though. Otherwise, this video will get too long. Carry on, though, Paul. You're doing a great job.
Is it possible that ketogenic diet is in so many ways burning the wick of your life faster?
No, it's doing no such thing, Paul. One of us, by the way, is burning their wick rapidly, apparently. Remember? And one of us isn't. Apparently.
Ketogenic diet is aging you faster. That's
dangerous. No, it doesn't. There is no evidence anywhere that a ketogenic diet will age you or does age you faster. Not at all. None.
Dangerous, and something for you to think about. Consider this paper: oxidative stress and aging is methylglyoxyl an enemy. Mm-hmm. It's a highly...
See, that's a question. See how that's a question, Paul? This is not an experiment that answers that question. They are proposing the question. This is an opinion piece. See how that works?
Reactive dicarbonyl metabolite formed during glucose protein and fatty acid metabolism.
Repeat that sentence to yourselves that Paul's just read out there as many times as is necessary for you to understand how Paul's assertions about methylglyoxyl and its production, retention, clearance rates are not borne out by his ideology. I'll do it for you. Okay. Reactive oxygen species are produced from the mitochondrial electron transport chain in many oxidative reactions. Great. Methylglyoxyl is a highly reactive dicarbonyl metabolite formed during glucose, protein, and fatty acid metabolism. Did you miss that, Paul?
Metabolism, especially during fatty acid metabolism, as we
know
during ketosis. Levels are 2.12 times higher on an Atkins diet with ketosis than they are doing glucose metabolism.
No, that study is unable to inform us on that. The noise to signal ratio is such that finding is of no value. It has no statistical power to speak of. It informs us in no way whatever on what the actual trends were in all of the very small number of individuals assessed during that study were. You've been fooled there, Paul, because you are incompetent to read statistics and understand what they mean, what they can inform us on, and what they can't. In other words, it's just another pointer to your incompetence to be a commentator in this area, and yet more, I guess, reason coming from me, who actually is a competent commentator in this field, that you should stop putting your toe in this pool. You should stop attempting to come across as anyone remotely credible in this field, because, son, you're not. You wouldn't know where to start. You haven't got the first clue of what you're talking about. It's embarrassing for you, but that's a minor issue. The major issue is that you are hugely, grossly misinforming the public in an unacceptable, misanthropic manner, which is tantamount to malpractice. At least it would be if you were indeed a practicing physician of any kind. Okay? You ought to be struck off the medical register for making comments right outside your field of competence. Again, you don't see me advertising my services as a psychiatrist, do you? No. And for good reason. I have no idea where to start. It's not my field. Okay? This is really straightforward, I would have thought.
They're elevated in hyperglycemia and other conditions, and excess of methylglyoxyl.
Yes, in hyperglycemia. How do we get hyperglycemia, by the way, Paul? Oh, yes, that's right. We pour hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of grams of carbohydrates down our necks. Having watched a Paul Saladino video wherein Paul reassured us that that was perfectly safe and an indicated and indeed even healthy thing to do. Criminal Paul Saladino. You ought to be in prison with no medical license. Okay?
Formation can increase reactive oxygen production.
Yeah, see the word can? That's like the word may. It leaves the other thing on the table. Maybe not too.
Cause oxidative stress. Methylglyoxyl reacts with protein.
Define oxidative stress, Paul. Operationally define that for us. No? Okay.
DNA and other biomolecules and is a major precursor of advanced glycation end products. I'll let you guys read through this article in detail if you'd like, but is this something that is accelerating aging? I fear that...
Well, there's no answer to that question. That question would require an experimental study over multiple decades with genetically identical human beings locked in labs at birth and kept under control for every aspect of their life except for the level of methylglyoxyl in their bodies, and see what happens in terms of their health spans and lifespans. Not ethical, not practical, not financially viable. Such a study will never be done. It will therefore remain a speculation. If it was a meaningful association, it's very, very likely that we would find that association by looking for it in prospective cohort studies. Has that been done, Paul? No. Okay, so you're just completely making noise. There is nothing to underpin the noise you're making. This is a vapid, vacuous, and extremely weak mechanistic speculation. I'll tell you what's real though, Paul. Images of people taken a few years apart or possibly over a decade apart to see the differences in how those people apparently are aging. That's real.
That it may be. So I know that many of you who are interested in these diets are doing so for the right reasons. And the people who are discussing these diets in a positive light on the social media are doing it for the right reasons. They want to.
Those that are saying the right things, Paul, are doing it for the right reasons and are saying the right things. Unfortunately, just about anybody can come online and say just about anything they feel like, just about, without actually supporting it. Example, everything that comes out of your mouth in the last 4 years or so, Paul. Absolute nonsense, all of it. Completely destitute of scientific understanding or competence, all of it. Dangerous, contraindicated misinformation, all of it. But you can, with carte blanche, you get away with doing this because First Amendment and all of that. What the hell? Maybe I should just set myself up as a psychiatrist. There you go, boys and girls. Want some psychiatric assessment and help? I'll sign you off. No experience, but I'll take a look at it for you. Ridiculous, Paul. Absolutely, fundamentally ridiculous.
To help you. But I think it's important that we understand the whole perspective.
Yes, and that's why you need to be a competent scientist before you start talking about what scientific articles are telling us, Paul. Because you can't read them. You don't have the skill set to read them. You don't know what they say and what the meaning of that is and how to apply that in its context in the real world, in the universe. And you then go off, for want of a better term, half-cocked, saying any ridiculous nonsense you want that subserves your ideology and your desperation, basically, to support what is ostensibly a carbohydrate addiction that you're suffering. One that will shorten your lifespan and your health span, absolutely, Paul, without any question. One that will cost you years of life. You know, it's a sad thing. It really is. I wish that people would drop the Dunning-Kruger, frankly, and understand that each of us has things that we are competent and or expert and or an authority in, and things that we are not. And Paul, you are not even remotely competent as a commentator on human nutrition or science or any of these related fields, let alone competent or expert or an authority. You are not. You need to shut this channel down and shut your mouth permanently on this topic. You are doing more harm than good to yourself and to everyone that listens to your podcasts and believes that you are credible because you have MD after your name. Anyone who's foolish enough to believe that. It's disgraceful, Paul. There is nothing to redeem your behavior. Nothing whatever. It has to stop sooner than yesterday. Okay?
When we are making a decision about how to structure our diets for optimal health, optimal aging, optimal...
Yes. Tell us all about optimal aging once again, Paul. Just remind us once again how to age optimally, please.
Longevity. Refer to the longevity podcast I did last year if you're curious about...
All right, you're also not an expert in longevity, Paul. You are a psychiatrist and a general physician. Remember?
How an animal-based diet, which is what I do advocate.
No, you don't, Paul. No. Just knock that on the head. You do not do an animal-based diet. That's not even disingenuous. That is straight out dishonest, Paul. Absolutely dishonest.
For, which is like a carnivore diet, but includes...
No, it isn't. The diet you do is nothing like a carnivore diet. Not at all.
Organs and meat.
It's nothing like a species-appropriate, species-specific diet for human beings or anywhere close.
Also, fruit, honey, raw dairy, other sources of carbohydrates. So this is my evolution, as many of you who are familiar with my work will know. So those are the two main...
Your evolution, you mean your deterioration, Paul. That's what you mean. See how badly you pronounced that word? Deterioration.
Major problems I see with ketosis, and there are many minor problems, electrolyte imbalances, hormones, sex hormone binding globulin, sleep disturbances.
None of those are a problem if you undertake a species-appropriate, sensibly designed, evolutionarily consistent diet for human beings, which is ketogenic. Absolutely, without any question. But none of those problems rear their ugly heads if you do that. In order to put that together, you should probably talk to someone who knows something about it, and that's not Paul Saladino.
All things that I talked about earlier. But the major ones are cortisol, connected...
No, that's not a problem.
...with 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1.
Yeah, that's not a problem. We dealt with that, remember, about an hour ago in this video. You've interpreted that paper totally incompetently, Paul.
And methylglyoxyl.
No. You've interpreted that one totally, completely destitute of any competence as well.
So, again, that is the framework of this conversation.
No, it isn't.
What are the problems with the ketogen?
Oh, that was it? Back to the start again? That's not the framework of any conversation that anyone sensible should be having. Anyone sensible will continue to follow me here on this fine, actually science-based channel, and from this point forward, will permanently ignore everything stated on any forum or any media whatsoever by Paul Saladino regarding nutrition, science, metabolic pathways, or any of those kind of things, because he knows nothing about that. Nothing whatever. You need to wake up and smell the bacon, people. Sorry about that if you're a fan of Paul's. I take no pleasure whatever from these videos about Paul, but I will never stop until Paul stops. One way or the other, he will. I'm hoping it's before it's too late for him. Frankly, I'm hoping that he wakes up and smells the bacon and gets his act together. I don't hold out much hope, to be fair, though. Join me next time when someone else will be wrong on the interwebs, and it'll probably be Paul Saladino again. See you then.